Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Alrighty, welcome and good morning, everybody, to CSIS. My name is Moises. I'm the director of the Future of Venezuela Initiative and fellow of the Americas program. Today's event is part of our series of virtual events to shed light on the unprecedented humanitarian crisis that Venezuela is going through. Just for the record, we'll be posting this video later in our website. We are also welcome your engagement during the Q&A section of this event. And today we're going to discuss a crucial topic, very interesting, very important for Venezuela and for the international community to start understanding better. As the UN prepares to choose a new resident and humanitarian coordinator for Venezuela, this expert panel will explore how the UN can better respond to the humanitarian situation within the country, address the Maduro regime's human rights violations, and facilitate efforts to resolve the country's ongoing political crisis. On July 15, just a few weeks ago, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, led by Michelle Bachelet, released a report detailing the human rights violation occurring in Venezuela. The report emphasizes the dire situation in Southern Venezuela, which has become a hub for illegal mining. More broadly, the report discusses the lack of independence in Venezuela's judiciary system, which has allowed security forces to systematically violate human rights and carry out extrajudicial killings with impunity, among many other issues that we're going to discuss today. I already discussed some of these issues in our Voices of Venezuela podcast with one of our panelists today, Tamara, the issue of human rights violations in Venezuela. The link of the podcast is in the event website, and the link of the UN report is also there. So I invite you to check them out. But after the event, we need your full attention right now. Let me just briefly tell you what we have in mind. I'm gonna briefly introduce the speakers before they provide 5 to 6 minutes of remarks. We're gonna start with Tamara Taraciuk, who's gonna give us an overview of the human rights situation in Venezuela. We're gonna follow with Miguel Pisarro, who's gonna provide remarks on the role of the interim government in working with the UN and what the UN can do to further help Venezuelans. And last but not least, we're gonna hear from Kerry Filippetti, who is gonna talk a little bit about how the UN can improve its Venezuela efforts and potentially facilitate a resolution to the political crisis. After the remarks, we're gonna follow with a moderated discussion, then followed by audience questions, and then do a wrap up by 12 o'clock. We're gonna hear first from Tamara Taraciuk. She's currently acting deputy director of Human Rights Watch Americas Division, covering several countries in the region. She has covered Venezuela for over 10 years, and she has also worked at the Latin American program of the Wilson Center and the Organization of Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the Organization of American States, or OAS. Thank you, Tamara, for joining us. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Moises. It's a pleasure to be here. So I would like to highlight a few of the key issues that the High Commissioner's report touch on. The report talks about the repression, the humanitarian emergency, the consequent massive exodus of Venezuelans. And I think it's an important reminder of how dire the situation on the ground is. And I'd like to highlight some of our findings linked specifically to the brutal crackdown and to the humanitarian emergency, which are important to understand in this discussion about the role of the United Nations and how the United Nations can play a role to address the situation in Venezuela. On the crackdown, I would say that unfortunately, talking about torture, disappearances, extrajudicial killings is not new, but it is important to have in mind how bad the situation is. The report, when it talks about torture, it gives some gruesome details about electric shocks in eyelids and genitals, brutal beatings, waterboarding. And the report specifically says that despite the limited number of cases they have documented, the number could be significantly higher. And this is consistent with what we've been finding in Venezuela since 2014. These are not isolated acts by rogue agents. This is part of a systematic practice by Venezuelan security forces, which operate hand in hand with armed pro-government groups in the commission of these horrible abuses against detainees. The report talks about the abuses in mining areas in the south of the country and describes how some armed pro-government groups that are called sindicatos, syndicates in Venezuela, enforce their rules with brutality and impunity. And what we found when doing research in this area, in the south, in the mining arc, is that actually this is happening constantly in mining areas by these armed groups, but also by Colombian guerrilla groups. The ELN is operating in the south of the country. They operate with impunity and with acquiescence by Venezuelan security forces. On killings, the report by the High Commissioner has talked, and she has talked in the past about killings by SPICE, a special police force that has a brutal record of obscure police practices. But the truth is that according to official statistics in Venezuela since 2016, there have been more than 18,000 killings in what authorities call resistance to authority. And these are supposed to be shootouts in the context of people resisting police operations. But when you dig deep into these cases and you talk to witnesses or to family members, what you find are cases of extrajudicial killings. And this 18,000 number is an official number. It's not something that NGOs or anyone else has made up. And the final point I would like to highlight is that the report talks about the absolute lack of judicial independence in Venezuela. This is not new. This has not started with Nicolás Maduro. In Venezuela since 2014, there was a political takeover. 2004, there was a political takeover of the Supreme Court. Gradually, this has eroded judicial independence to a point where today there is not even a pretense of independence. And this is very important because this combination of egregious abuses with total impunity is what mandates international investigations to bring accountability to victims, because they will never be able to find accountability in Venezuela today. Last year in September, the UN Human Rights Council created a fact-finding mission specifically to look into the gravest human rights abuses in Venezuela. They are supposed to present a report in September in the upcoming sessions in Geneva, and this is an incredibly important opportunity to provide evidence to support ongoing investigations, including the preliminary examination by the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. So it's this work and extend the mandate of this fact-finding mission for the UN to play a critical role in accountability for these egregious abuses. And on the humanitarian emergency, very briefly, Venezuela has been facing a humanitarian emergency before COVID. We have documented how there have been increasing rates of child malnutrition and malnutrition generally, food insecurity, diseases that have been eradicated and are preventable by vaccination, like measles or diphtheria came back. And in this context of a pre-existing collapsed health system, the pandemic hit Venezuela. And it's getting worse and worse. We're seeing shortages of water in houses, in hospitals. We've spoken to doctors who tell us that they have to wash their hands with water that drips from the air conditioning to be able to wash their hands between seeing patients. There's overcrowding in prisons and in low-income communities. And this generates conditions in which the most basic measures to prevent the spread of the disease are impossible. You can't wash your hands. You can't maintain social distancing. This, coupled with very limited testing, massive use of rapid testing of COVID-19 that has proven to show that it can provide false negative results. Venezuelans who have left host countries in Latin America due to the economic situation are now back in Venezuela. They are being subject to treatment, not only the way the authorities treat them, which is calling them people who bring a disease from abroad, people who are weapons, biological weapons that bring COVID. But the actual protocol that the authorities have created for the treatment of returnees is thought of, it's created for a country like Switzerland, not Venezuela, where people are put in containment centers where there is overcrowding and there is lack of access to water, and they are bound to spread the disease more than contain it. In this context, the numbers that come out of Venezuela regarding COVID are impossible to beat. The latest statistics, according to Johns Hopkins, are over 20,000 cases and 174 deaths. That is ridiculous. Even more so when you're talking about a country where a regime is cracking down on journalists, on doctors who try to provide information on what is actually happening in the ground. In this context, the United Nations could play a fundamental role. What is essential here is to ensure a massive, large-scale UN-led humanitarian response that is apolitical, that can actually put the people first and save lives. In this context, a recent agreement between the opposition and the authorities responding to Nicolás Maduro that the PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, would provide some aid to be able to assist the COVID response is an extremely important step. What is critical now is to see how it's implemented and who is going to monitor that implementation. The UN obviously has a role to play on the issue of migrants outside of Venezuela, but we're focusing now on the situation in the country. And these two aspects are critical to understand the role that the UN could actually play to support the fight for human rights in Venezuela.
Tamara, thank you so much. That was great. I think that's putting into context what we're going to be discussing later, which is, again, what you said, the role of UN to engage. For that, we have next Miguel Pisarro. He served as commissioner of the Guaido government for the United Nations and for humanitarian assistance. He currently serves as chairman of the Special Committee for monitoring the entry of humanitarian aid and as chairman of the Permanent Committee for Social Development, which he also chaired in 2016. He's also diputado or a congressman in the legitimate democratic elected National Assembly in Venezuela. Miguel, thank you for joining us. Great to have you.
Thank you, Moises, and thank you for this space. Thanks to Tamara and Gary also for sharing this, and CSIS for the invitation. I will speak a little bit about the progress inside of the UN system made by the interim government and the National Assembly. I believe that much of the progress that has been achieved at the UN is because what's happening in our country is becoming more and more serious, and it's becoming also more evident every day. Tamara has shown us a clear X-ray of the situation right now in Venezuela. And for years, organizations like Human Rights Watch and other international NGOs, together with great civil society activists inside of the country and representatives of different state members, have been denouncing what is happening in Venezuela. And I believe that a serious crisis of legitimacy of Maduro's regime has added to this a new situation inside of the system. Although officially within the UN, Nicolás Maduro continues to be recognized as the president, and is his delegation the ones occupying a chair in the Human Rights Council, in the General Assembly, and within the UN. I think the interaction and the dialogue with the representative of the interim government and the National Assembly has increased in the last year. And I think this is happening mainly because in the UN, like a dozen of countries in the world, recognize that first, the National Assembly is the last legitimate power in the country. Second, this allow us a greater approachment coupled with the pressure of state members that are continually making inside of the system to make what's happening in Venezuela visible. But also particularly in the reference to the interim government and their relationship with the UN, I think we understood an important part. We understood that the last remaining redoubt of diplomacy for Maduro's regime was inside of the UN. And understanding that was a key and a major change in our strategy for diplomacy. Because until a few years ago, and for a few years ago, I referred to the government of Chavez, Venezuela was seen as an exemplary country within the United Nations. The agencies were using Venezuela as an example for social model, for political model, They were speaking about the Venezuelan revolution as the emancipation of the indigenous population or the preservation of the lands, when the reality inside of a country was that the crisis was accelerating every day. And since 2015, we are trying and we are making efforts to the humanitarian emergency in the country to be recognized not only by the regime, also by the UN. And I think the regime during this period of time was carrying out a billionaire propaganda exercise to make the people believe that malnutrition or poverty rates were decreasing, when in reality the situation was only getting worse and worse, and the structural problems was starting to be huge without being solved. Back then, it was impossible to think what we have today. And what we have today, a system talking about what is happening in Venezuela, what's happening with the refugee situation. Now the OHCHR says that after Syria, we are the second largest human displacement crisis in the world. And this refugee situation is the only one without a war or without a natural disaster in a country. We have right now a system speaking about human rights situation. And I think the summary Tamara just made about torture, extrajudicial killing, denial in the access to justice, and the gold extraction and indigenous massacres, it's really important to us. We have a system now speaking about the humanitarian emergency. And we have finally an humanitarian response plan, and humanitarian needs overview, but also we have assessments like the assessment of the World Food Program, which is say that 1/3 of the population, Moises, 1/3 of the Venezuelans are right now food insecure. That means 1 of every 3 Venezuelans doesn't have the money or the access to have the basic needs and the basic food for their life. But also the system changed. As a result of the support of a lot of countries, now we have mandates in the Human Rights Council. We have special procedures like the fact-finding mission. And also we have an important lobby with OHCHR for the humanitarian emergency, with ACNUR and IOM for the Response for Venezuela platform. And I think the system as a whole is starting to change the position it has. Even in groups, like for a lot of people it's not that relevant, but for us it's really important, like the group of arbitrary detentions now have rules in the cases of Marrero and Requesens. Only to close this opening remarks, Moises, I think this is possible because of the pressure. This is possible because the state members has understood in the same way we did that the UN is a place where we have to play, we have to speak, and we have to take decisions. But also it's important to have a clear contrast in things that are happening right now. The UN, a lot of times, have problems with the access. A lot of times they remain silent, or they change the tone of what they have to say because they want to have the access into the country, or they want to avoid being expelled. And the UN we need is a UN without fear. It's a UN politically committed. It's a UN understanding the humanitarian role they can play, understanding that in a conflict like the Venezuelan conflict, if they don't play the middle role, if they don't play the role of the brokers of humanitarian agreements like we did with PAHO, it's really hard to scale up and to find the real solution we want. And also, we need a UN without self-censorship and committed in the political part, because we can address the consequence, and we can have humanitarian response plans, we can have refugee plans, and we can have everything. But we have also to address the cause. And the cause of all of this is Nicolás Maduro's regime and his attempt to remain in power no matter at what cost.
Great, thank you, Miguel. I want to come back to these issues very quick after Carrie's, but it's important that we discuss the UN fear of being expelled out of the country and how we balance that with the other efforts, right? Carrie, thank you for joining. Carrie Filippetti currently serves as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere's Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Prior to this position, Carrie served as a Senior Policy Advisor for the U.S. mission to the UN, where she advised U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley on issues related to counterterrorism, the Middle East, the Western Hemisphere. Carrie, it's great to have you. Thank you for joining us this morning. So back to you.
Great, thank you, Moises, and many thanks to CSIS for all of your excellent panel discussions. and also to Miguel and to Tamara for joining this discussion. I want to ask that that the audience kind of humor me for a second, because as you mentioned, I was both at the U.S. mission to the UN and now dealing with Venezuela. So this is the first time that I get to discuss both of my passions at once. You know, before we look at the current UN system and what it can do to adjust what's going on in Venezuela, I think it's critically important that we look at and understand what the United Nations was truly founded to achieve. And so you can go back to the UN Charter. Under Chapter 1, it talks about these 4 founding purposes of the United Nations, and I want to go through those. The first is the one for which the UN is probably best known, which is to maintain international peace and security, and to take collective action and to take collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to peace and security. The second is to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principles of equal rights and self-determination. I sort of broadly refer to this as the sovereignty principle. The third is to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights. And the fourth and final is to be a center for harmonizing the action of nations in the attainment of these common ends, something that I kind of refer to as the end of great power conflict. So I want to take each of these and look at the case study of Venezuela and how the United Nations is actually fulfilling or failing to fulfill some of those founding principles. So first, the maintenance of international peace and security. So in the last few years, we've seen what began as really an internal human rights issue within Venezuela into a significant threat to the region. It's become so significant that we've seen the invocation of the Rio Treaty by the region for the first time really in 50 years in terms of real action. And it's also why the Lima Group was developed in an effort for the region to come together in support of democracy inside Venezuela. This is actually a pretty common trend. Ambassador Haley, when she was at the United Nations back in 2017, raised the issue of Venezuela to the Security Council. At the time, there was an effort to block her from doing so. And the argument was this was a human rights issue, not an issue of international peace and security. And therefore, the Security Council had no reason to discuss it. You know, it really is the case, however, that the international system needs to recognize that it is a very common trend for human rights violations in one country to later become threats to international peace and security. And unfortunately, Ambassador Haley's vision has become reality. In the last few years, we've seen a resurgence of both FARC-D and ELN combatants who are both emboldened by the Maduro regime's backing, as well as the general inability of the Venezuelan security forces to actually enforce any action against them, which has threatened Colombia most directly, but also other surrounding countries. We've seen, as was mentioned, a Venezuelan refugee crisis that mirrors that of Syria with 5.1 million refugees, but has been done in far less time. I mean, Syria had over a decade to develop those kinds of numbers. And we're only really looking at a few years within the Venezuela context. And of course, we've also seen increased cooperation between the Maduro regime and both Iran, as well as North Korea. We're seeing recent reports that the cooperation between DPRK and the Maduro regime may actually be in violation of US sanctions. And so the UN's failure to really address the nexus between human rights and international peace and security has unfortunately delayed the UN's response when it comes to Venezuela, which has put neighboring countries like Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador at significant risk. Second was this sovereignty principle, securing the rights of self-determination. So I think it's really important because people misuse the term sovereignty when they're talking about Venezuela. It's really important that we understand that self-determination and sovereignty in a democracy refer to the consent of the people, right? That is the key principle. The authority of a state and its government are created by the consent of the people in a democracy. And should that consent be lost, the question of who is in charge is not merely who says they are, but the people's will as expressed by a vote. And despite the Maduro regime's best efforts, Venezuela is still, at least constitutionally, if not in practice, it is constitutionally a democracy. And so because Nicolas Maduro and his corrupt allies prevented a free and fair election in May 2018, both the Constitution of Venezuela as well as the will of the Venezuelan people established Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela with the authority to organize new presidential elections. So this is the key principle of popular sovereignty, and yet the UN has not recognized the sovereign will of the people of Venezuela. And so the Maduro regime, and this is something Miguel mentioned, the Maduro regime's continued recognition of Maduro, or the UN's continued recognition of Maduro, is not only a violation of the founding principles of the United Nations, but it also perpetuates significant other challenges that undermine the additional three principles, including the free flow of humanitarian assistance and the promotion of human rights. The third founding principle of the UN was to address issues of social, economic, or humanitarian character and to promote human rights. And here, as Tamara mentioned, the UN has really made some significant inroads when it comes to documentation. I don't want to go back over all of the wonderful information that Tamara provided, but essentially it's largely thanks to UN assessments that we know the extent of the refugee crisis, that we know the extent of the humanitarian crisis, and that we know the extent of, for example, the food insecurity that Miguel mentioned. So this documentation is critically important. It's also important that we understand, going back to the economic piece of the UN's charter, the Venezuelan economy has contracted almost 85% in the years since Maduro came into power. And oil production has decreased from 3.3 million barrels per day under Chavez to 350,000 barrels per day under Maduro. So you're talking about extreme economic mismanagement, which is, again, perpetuating all of these health and human rights and humanitarian issues. And so, again, the UN on this third founding principle has done a very good job in terms of documentation and raising awareness. And then the fourth and final principle of the UN that I mentioned is to harmonize the action of nations. Again, this end of great power conflict. I think we can all agree that we are not in a period of the end of great power conflict. Perhaps we are fortunate that we don't have a war between the great powers at this moment, but far from harmony, we still see Russia and China consistently attempt to use their voice, to use their veto to block the mere discussion of Venezuela. I think we saw this, the UN recently hosted a session on the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, co-hosted by the Dominican Republic and Germany. And of course, Russia lamented the international community's involvement in the issue, despite the fact that it's the clear mandate of the UN to focus on these issues. So those four principles lead us to what the UN's role is and how we can really improve its efforts to address the Venezuelan crisis in particular. And I think there's really two separate categories to the question of how we can improve the UN's response. The first and probably most significant is broader UN reform. This is something I'm happy to discuss in the question and answer session in more detail, but suffice it to say that the broader reform of the Human Rights Council in particular, at which Venezuela under the Maduro regime has a seat, as well as in the Security Council, is really vital to addressing the longer term challenges and ensure the UN effectively fulfills its sort of four-pronged purpose. But until we get that reform, there's still a lot of things the international community and the UN can do to improve the lives of Venezuelans and to bring the country closer to a political solution. So first, this is something similar to what Miguel mentioned. We need the UN to think through its balance between access and achievement. I think Miguel described this as a UN without fear. And this is something that I've seen not just with the United Nations, but with many international organizations. And I also would be curious about Tamara's view here in her role as Human Rights Watch. But access is, of course, critical. The UN needs to be present in order to document these kinds of abuses, which we mentioned are so essential to developing policies in the United States and elsewhere. Access is a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. And all too often, we've seen the United Nations' fears of being kicked out prevent it from actually using that access to achieve something. The second is we need to focus on a key element of the UN Charter, which I mentioned. It prioritizes what it calls collective measures or action. This nowadays the international community is really satisfied almost with mere statements. Words are a part of policy, but they're not policy in its entirety. So the UN needs to utilize its resources to achieve results, and member states of the United Nations need to stop abrogating their responsibility to push for this action. Now, I understand why. The fear is a fear of conflict, that if there's collective action, then there will be, threats to the lives and livelihood of people in the region. But I would just point out, there are threats to the lives and livelihood of people in the region now. Inaction has done nothing to curb that. And so we really need to take a stand and do something about it, and not just issue statements talking about how we support democracy. We need to actually support democracy. And I think one example here is an issue that Tamara brought up, which is she talked about this fact-finding mission that was created last year. The text of the resolution that developed that talked about, if there's not a significant improvement in the human rights conditions on the ground, then it's time to go to a commission of inquiry, which is sort of a much higher standard with much better access and more mandates to actually do something. It's going to be a test of the international community whether or not we push for a COI. I think we absolutely need to, and that's another way that that the international community and the UN can do more in Venezuela. And third, we need to deploy unconventional UN resources. So I think for far too long, the United States has prioritized the Security Council and the General Assembly, and it's in some cases the Human Rights Council, over and above the multitude of technical agencies that have a critical role in Venezuela. But we can creatively deploy agencies like the International Labor Organization to handle labor violations, UNODC on crime and drug trafficking, UNESCO and UN Environment on gold mining and the destruction of protected ecosystems. And certainly when we get to a transitional government, we will need the UN to consider deploying its electoral observation missions to ensure the presidential election is free and fair. And then finally, I promise this is my last point. Finally, we need to ensure the UN adheres to its own standards of neutrality in the deployment of humanitarian assistance, and ensure all assistance is delivered on the basis of need, not political motivation. So this is why Commissioner Pisarro's humanitarian agreement regarding PAHO is so game-changing. It hopefully will build the foundation for even more humanitarian cooperation to ensure the regime does not use the distribution of food and medical assistance for political gain. And so those are just a few examples of the things that we can do to activate the UN in support of both Venezuelan democracy, but also importantly in support of its own founding principles. This is something we need to continue to address at the UN level, but also something we need to address with member states, because the issues with the UN are also issues with the international community as a whole. We cannot continue to believe that words alone are action. Well, because every day that goes by leads to more death and destruction and malnutrition when it comes to the people of Venezuela. So we need to come together as an international community, both within the UN and outside of it, to fight for the principles of international peace and security, to fight for the principles of self-determination, to fight for human rights, humanitarian assistance, and the international cooperation, all of which was the principles upon which the UN was founded. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Carrie. That was great framework. I think I much better understand now where we are on the UN and what needs to be done moving forward. Let's engage. We have a lot of things to cover today. I want to jump on two key issues that I took down from Carrie's and Miguel's. Back to you, Tamara. I want to hear from you and come back to the High Commissioner Ambassador's recent report. So in light of this report, I'm hearing Carrie saying that, you know, one of the things that we can improve in the UN is to, instead of depending on a collective measure which drive inaction, we need more actions. So in light of the report that we just saw in July 15, is there any hope that the UN will take meaningful action to prevent human rights abuses by the Maduro regime, particularly given the regime has a seat on the UN Human Rights Council? How do you see that issue?
I think it's important. The UN is a monster, right? There's so many different parts to the UN. And I think the idea that both Miguel and Carrie were talking about, that the UN, that this fear of speaking out to preserve access is a big issue when you're dealing with both human rights and humanitarian assistance. And I think we need to separate both. When you talk to humanitarian actors, both from the UN system and outside the UN system, they have this fear of speaking out because you need to preserve access to deliver aid, which is the main purpose. When you're talking about an NGO like MSF, that is perfectly reasonable because that is their mandate. When you're talking about the UN, you need leadership to provide actual apolitical large-scale humanitarian aid. And that is not going to happen with a silent diplomacy at the highest level. And at the beginning, the reaction by Secretary General Guterres was shamelessly silent about the situation in Venezuela. And it has started to change over the past year, I would say. It's still not as vocal as we hope it would be, to be able to press the Maduro regime to accept this aid, because the key to this is in the hands of the regime. When you talk about human rights issues, on the other hand, I think the situation is different. Someone who is documenting and exposing human rights abuses has to be, if you are on the UN, on the side of the victim. And there is no dilemma there. I mean, access is important. And the fact that Bachele's office has a presence in Caracas could help have closer access to victims. And I do know that they have helped in some cases to get attention to specific cases. But that doesn't mean staying silent. In terms of actual accountability from the UN side, I think the fact-finding mission is the best option we have in terms of actually gathering evidence of egregious abuses, trying to determine the chain of command and specific individual responsibility. And that report could be the basis for stronger investigations by the fact-finding mission. As Carrie was saying, there is the possibility to move forward to a commission of inquiry, which is the stronger subsequent resort. And this is combined to the role that the ICC could play in actually prosecuting individuals for the abuses that they have committed. So, I mean, I think it's a complex role, and it's understandable to a certain extent when NGOs involved in the humanitarian world face this dilemma. I don't think it's acceptable when you're talking about the highest levels of the United Nations. They need to ensure that that access happens and that it is apolitical. And that is key, because that's the only way it will actually reach the people, because there is a tendency, and we've seen it with the collapse boxes, with the delivery of food in the past, that Venezuelan authorities that respond to Maduro will politicize aid. And that means that not everyone will get it, and a lot of people will suffer. And the one final point I would make there is, one thing that is key here is ensuring full access of the World Food Program, that together with its partners has the logistical capacity to distribute this humanitarian apolitical aid. So pressure from the UN and other governments to the Maduro regime to ensure that that actually happens sooner rather than later is critical.
I want to get into that in Miguel, but before we turn to Miguel, Tamara, I have 60 seconds. Walk us through a little bit through the process of getting the fact-finding mission. And you know, as you said, this is an important tool that we can use. In September, we're gonna have a new report coming out. Walk us through the process of how getting reliable, transparent, fact-finding missions works in Venezuela, and what is the reaction of the Maduro regime in 60 seconds, if you can get it?
Okay, so I think there's two sides to your question. In terms of getting the actual fact-finding mission set up in Geneva in September, it was a tough battle because at the time, there were two competing resolutions that were being debated in the Human Rights Council. One, to ensure that Bachele's office maintained access and a presence in the country, and another to create the fact-finding mission, originally a commission of inquiry that ended up being the fact-finding mission. And clearly that posed a dilemma. You know, do we preserve access or do we push for a stronger investigation? The diplomatic back and forth ended up backfiring for the regime because in the end we got both. And we got a resolution that said, you know, they authorized access by Bachele. And we got a resolution saying you need to collaborate because we have this fact-finding mission that is investigating these horrendous abuses. And if you don't collaborate and this doesn't work out, then we can go to a commission of inquiry. So, the end result was a good one for us, pushing for accountability. And I do think that this is the same debate that we're going to be seeing in Geneva in September this year. Are we going to preserve access, or are we going to push for accountability? And there's no reason to choose one over the other. I mean, the reality is that both can serve a purpose, but access cannot come at the expense of accountability. Another issue that Rio question raises, and I'm over my 50 seconds, is how do you actually do fact-finding in a country like Venezuela, where clearly the regime doesn't allow access of these international monitors? But I'm not going to have time to get into it.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you so much. Miguel, look, I've been hearing a lot about this access restraints issue that we have in Venezuela. I want to come back to that issue, right? So how does international community, especially through the UN, go about providing aid to Venezuelan people, right, to address the humanitarian crisis within the country, not in the region, but within Venezuela, while at the same time applying pressure to the Maduro regime, which is more or less the policy that we have right now by the Western countries, but at the same time condemning human rights violations, and at the same time leaving open the window for a diplomatic role and a negotiation route to get out of the political crisis. So how do we balance all of these efforts in the context and the limitations that the UN has? Any reactions to that?
Yeah, Moises, I think that the first part of this balance is understanding what's the role the UN should be playing. I think it's really clear for all of us that there's a before and after the High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet report of July of last year. There's a before and after the first humanitarian response plan and its overview of last year and right now. There's an before and after of first report of the refugee situation and the R4B platform assessment report and right now. And I think that's the first part, having the UN being a real shower of what's happening inside of a country and having the UN saying in the proper way the facts of what's happening inside. Second, related to humanitarian aid and humanitarian response, I want to follow where Tamara lead with the World Food Program access. Right now, we have an humanitarian country team on the ground, we have an humanitarian architecture on the ground, and we have an humanitarian response plan. What we don't have full and unrestrained access in the country. Right now, even when we have humanitarian response, international NGOs are not being able to register inside of a country, and most of the agencies are not having the real access they deserve and they should to provide aid. Second, we don't have a real logistic cluster being developed because the regime are not allowing the World Food Program to go fully operational in the country. And without the World Food Program inside, we are not going to have a real logistic cluster working. And without real logistics, we are not going to have the independence and the autonomy the humanitarian aid should have. We want to preserve the humanitarian space. And these small step forwards we already taken before and we already had, we want to preserve it, but understanding that this level of access and this level of deploy on the ground is not the level needed. Third, I think it's important to understand that the times of diplomacy are not the times of the crisis. And a lot of times the bureaucracy in the UN system sees 1 year of a short term, a short period of time. And in Venezuela, 1 year means 1/4 of the children not growing the way it should. 1 year means thousands of people dying before of illness reappearing or for lack of medicines. So we need to renew the sense of urgency inside of the system. And this leads me to the last point of this intervention, Moises, that is the Security Council. Sadly, we have a polarization among stakeholders in the Security Council, and not even for the humanitarian response. We see it last week. We were part of a side event hosted by Germany and Dominican Republic, and when you hear the speech of some countries' members of the Security Council politicizing and using as a polarized tool the humanitarian situation inside of Venezuela and the access you see why the Security Council and the UN is in some sort of a stalemate. It is not moving anywhere. But it's not only in the case of Venezuela. It's also in the case of DPRK, in the case of Syria, in the case of Iran. And sadly, those are the new friends of Maduro's regime: Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Thank you, Moises.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Carrie, I want to come back to you. You know, about 2-3 months ago, we hosted Elliot Abrams at CSIS. It was a great conversation we had. And, you know, in few words, he said something along the lines, in Venezuela, you have 3 options. 1, magic. If you believe in magic, then that's one option. 2, some sort of military intervention, which no one wants, and the US or anybody in the international communities, I don't think that's a realistic option at all. And then 3rd, he said some sort of negotiated solution, right? So more or less, he said those three were the options for Venezuela. So I want to ask you, talking now in the context of the UN, what role can the UN play when it comes to facilitating a political negotiation in Venezuela?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, you know, I want to start by looking at those 3 possibilities that the special representative laid out, and note that it's not that you sort of pick one and go towards that. It's that the longer that time goes by, the fewer options we end up having, other than some kind of a military solution, not because the United States is pushing for it, but because ultimately, when there's appeasement for this amount of time, we've seen historically, either the inside Venezuela, people will get frustrated and revolt, or the military will revolt. And so the United States has elected to pursue a political and a negotiated settlement as the safest and most likely option. But every day that goes by that there's more inaction on the part of the international community, more refusal to really push the regime into a negotiation in good faith, the farther along this road toward eventual violence we get. And so what we're trying to do, especially when we talk about preserving all options, is to note we are trying to get to a negotiated settlement before it gets so bad that it blows up in some way that the United States and the international community can't really ensure the safety of the population. And so, yes, we are pushing for a political settlement, a negotiated settlement. In terms of how the UN can have a role here, I don't see the UN as leading a negotiation. I just don't see that as being possible in terms of the fact that they continue to recognize the Maduro regime. They haven't really played an essential role. As Tamara said, the Secretary General has been relatively quiet for quite some time. And so I just don't think they have the ability to get us to a political negotiation. That said, the UN can serve a role, which is to try to ensure that the international community comes behind as sort of a general consensus the idea of a political settlement. The United Nations is very aware of what principles are required for there to be free and fair elections, what the minimum conditions are, what those standards are. The UN can and should be doing more to promote that idea, to make it incredibly clear that under no circumstances will this election for the parliament be free and fair, as evidenced by the fact that the Maduro regime has implemented exactly 0 of the minimum conditions for free and fair elections. And so the UN can be much more forceful in those kinds of actions, and more forceful in promoting a political negotiation, perhaps led by Norway, since they've already expressed an interest in the past, and on the basis of the framework for a political transition, which the U.S. Secretary of State pushed forward a few months ago.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was great. Hey, I want to start engaging the Q&A from the audience. I have one question for you, Miguel. This is coming from Joel Charney, Norwegian Refugee Council in the USA. And, I think I mentioned in the beginning of the event, Well, he's asking, what are the opposition's expectations for the new resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator for the UN? Like, what are your views on that? Like, is that position going to be relevant, especially after this discussion?
Absolutely, Moises. I think that's one of the key positions, and we need in that position someone absolutely committed to build humanitarian agreements, to scale up in the political access, to understanding that the UN have a different role on the ground. And if we want more good experience like the PAHO agreement, the one we achieved using the National Assembly and the Pan American Health Organization to provide aid in the country using frozen assets, we need more committed resident coordinator and agencies. I think part of what we need in the country also is humanitarian diplomacy. And for that, the agencies and those roles plays a major part in trying to broker some deals and to find more space. And also related to the elections, we are going to a new fraudulent election by the end of the year. Maduro's regime are destroying all the electoral conditions and are destroying all the possibilities of participation for the democratic forces. An involvement of the resident coordinator and the Department of Peace Building and Political Affairs of the UN in these kind of matters is really important. Not only not to be part of a fraud, not only saying we are not going to be the ones giving legitimacy to this, also being the ones raising the concerns and the yellow flag before the things happen. Because in Venezuela, sadly, we have a lot of commitment of people after the things happen. And in this case, we have plenty of time to avoid things to happen in our country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you. I have one more question for Tamara, and then I want to close with Carrie. Unfortunately, we have about 8 minutes left. Want to start getting wrap up. Tamara, I have one question for you. This is coming from Dr. Leopoldo Villegas from Global Development One. He's saying that the OHCHR, the Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights, estimations of the population in need in the Venezuelan humanitarian response are incorrect. Is there any discussion going on to update the real numbers and to update the humanitarian situation, and what are the next steps on this? And then he follows and said, what are the mechanisms in place for transparency among all implementing partners in monitoring the response? So that kind of is connected to what you were describing about the fact-finding mission and all the efforts. I want to hear from you and get deeper on that issue.
Sure, thanks. That's a very good question. One of the big problems to deal with the humanitarian situation in Venezuela is precisely the poor data that is coming out from authorities. This has been a problem to deal with the humanitarian situation before COVID, and it is a problem now with COVID. The OHCHR estimations that came out indicated, and this is the first time Guterres actually said something, and it was through a tweet when he acknowledged that 7 million people in Venezuela were in need of humanitarian assistance. That was in April last year. Clearly, this is just like the tip of the iceberg and the beginning of acknowledging the extent of the problem. But the lack of data is a huge problem. And it's a huge problem because authorities have failed to produce epidemiological data since 2016. And this makes it, makes everything much more complicated. We know the numbers that they're reporting on COVID cases and COVID deaths, and they don't acknowledge the extent of the problem. But we can't even evaluate the actual impact because, for example, there's no morbidity or mortality data available to check, for example, how many people died in May compared to May last year, to be able to figure out if more people are dying in the country compared to a year before when we did not have COVID. So one of the key things in terms of recommendations moving forward is to allow an independent third actor to actually evaluate and provide adequate information about the extent of the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. Because with that diagnosis, you can't actually have a proper measure in place to address the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. And just one final point that I think is important. this is one of the main reasons why this is a human rights problem, because this is not the consequence. The humanitarian situation in Venezuela is not the consequence of a natural disaster. It's the consequence of public policies and practices by the Maduro regime. And hiding data and not acknowledging the full extent of the problem is one of the main reasons why that's the case.
Thank you, Tamara. Great. Carrie, I didn't want to finish this event without putting into context the reality that we're all working from home, and you know, we're not social distancing, and many of the employees of the UN are in fact working from home as well. So I wanted to, you know, ask you, how do you practice diplomacy, the fine arts of diplomacy, just traditionally has been in person, right? An in-person practice or art, when the conference rooms sit empty, meetings are via Zoom, and the entire staff is working from home. So how do we engage the UN in Venezuela, which is an urgent issue? And Miguel pointed out that the diplomacy times are so different from the Venezuela crisis times. So how do we work this out within this context where we are in the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Moises. I think that's a really good question, and obviously we're learning as we go. You know, we're able to do panels like this on Zoom. It's perfectly fine, but when it comes to some of the more sensitive discussions that we need to be having in terms of strategy for how we're approaching the General Assembly or what we're asking for, obviously it does get a little bit more complicated. I think the good news is, you know, because our previous diplomacy up till now was so much in person and so much about building relationships, we're able to call upon those pre-existing relationships. I think it would be quite difficult to start from scratch, you know, people who you don't already know, to be able to have a genuine conversation over the phone. One thing that does make me a little bit nervous in terms of how the United Nations has itself chosen to respond to the pandemic is that it's my understanding that when it comes to the General Assembly and High Level Week and so on, where, you know, we're now moving to a virtual forum, you're really missing some key opportunities to pull aside and have conversations with individual representatives, to make sure that you're kind of having the discussions, the informal discussions that really are the backbone of diplomacy. But you also have another problem, which is that the United Nations, it's my understanding, when it comes to the General Assembly this year, is largely moving to a consensus-based format. Resolutions during the General Assembly will only pass if they have the consent of everybody involved. That is incredibly difficult. And unfortunately, in a sort of democratic voting-based system, if you err to consensus, you're moving to the lowest common denominator. It's sort of as if you make the Russian veto in the Security Council the be-all end-all for every possible resolution out there, and that is extremely dangerous. And frankly, I don't think any member state has it as their interest to have something passed by full consensus, because to do that is impossible when you look at these blocks of states that are anti-democratic, that violate human rights. Respectfully, if you look at the EU, which is based on consensus, think about how slow that moves with 27 countries. Now, you know, think about adding over 150 additional countries, over 170 additional countries. It's not a viable system. So the UN does need to think about the future. How do we have a virtual General Assembly that can be a little bit more sophisticated than being exclusively consensus-based? And they haven't made, I think, enough progress on that front for this year. God forbid we're in this situation in years to come. They will need to really be thoughtful about that.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I hope this brings an opportunity for the UN and others to adapt and to look into the future now, because again, it's a new reality for the time being. Unfortunately, we run out of time. I want to thank you all, our panelists, for joining today. It's been an incredible conversation. I really appreciate it. As we continue to work to discuss the role of the international community to help Venezuela, I think it's critically to understand what the multilateral institutions, right, that like the UN can do to help further. I mean, there's much more that needs to be done. Now we have the challenge of the pandemic, so we need to be very active on this front on the UN and the international community. Understanding these nuances is critical. It's necessary if we want to build a successfully an international community response to Venezuela. Inaction is not an option, like Kerry and others said. So we need actions from the UN systems and others. The Future of Venezuela Initiative at CSIS greatly appreciate all of your insights, and we look forward to working with you as we continue our research and in each of the challenges and opportunities. But thank you again for everybody for joining. Have a great day.